Hello, you are welcome to our last discussion on the core functions of management. As you might be aware, we started this whole discussion with planning, and we explained that during the planning stage, it is the responsibility of the manager to set the goals or the objectives of the organization, establish the strategies or the tactics that will be required, and then also establish timelines as to when which activity is supposed to be done. From there, you move to the next core function of a manager, which is organizing. At the organizing stage, it is important that you gather the resources that will be needed to ensure that you'll be able to achieve your objectives or the goals that you establish during the planning stage. Beyond having the requisite resources, it is also important to have the appropriate structure in the organization to ensure the efficient and effective utilization of the resources of the organization. After organizing, we discussed the concept of leadership or leading. We indicated that you might have the right goals, you might have the right strategies and tactics in place, you might have the right structures in place as an organization, but it takes leadership to ensure the efficient utilization of the resources and the structures and systems in the organization in order to be able to achieve the goals and the objectives that were set during the planning stage. All right, so we're coming to look at the last core function, which is controlling. And it is important for me to reiterate again that even though we have them organized in a systematic way, the core functions, we started with planning, then got to organizing, then we discussed leading, and we're now coming to look at the concept of control or controlling. That is not how things happen in practice. Okay, in practice, for example, you need leadership at each stage. You need leadership when you are engaged in planning. You need leadership during the process of organizing and setting in place the right structures of the organization. So it is with control as well. All right, you need control mechanisms right from the planning, the organizing, and even the leadership stage of the management process. So it is not as if in practice they are systematic. At each process, you will need one of the other functions as being an important requirement to be able to fulfill that particular function. So we shouldn't think that as a manager, you first and foremost have to plan. The next step to do is to organize, and the next step is to control, is to lead, and the last step is to control. No, all of these processes interact with each other. It's just for the sake of proper understanding or clarity that we start with planning, we move to organizing, we move to leading, and this morning we're going to look at the concept of control. Okay, so at this point, I want to share the slides so that we can all focus on the slide in order to get a proper understanding of what we're coming to talk about. All right, so just spare me a moment. I'll share the slides with you for us to begin our discussion on the concept of control. Yes, so our topic today, as I indicated, is control or controlling. And the objectives that we'll be looking at is to understand the concept of control, the interdependence of control and other functions of management, the various steps involved in the control function, the methods of control, the importance of control, and then the various tools and techniques of control. Okay. So control is concerned with the task of ensuring that what is performed is kept within prescribed management channels to achieve organizational objectives. So if you are engaged in controlling, You want to ensure that whenever people or your employees are working, they are working within the systems and the channels or structures that have been put in place in order to be able to achieve organizational objectives. All right. And otherwise, control can be comprehensively defined as a function of management that involves measuring and correcting the subordinates' performance of activities to ensure that organizational plans and objectives are achieved. So if you are engaged in controlling, first and foremost, you need to know that it is one of the core functions of management, and it involves measuring and correcting subordinates' performance. All right. So first and foremost, before you can even measure, what it means is that there is a criteria that has been put in place, or there is a standard that has been put in place. So you measure what has actually been done and then compare with the criteria or the standard that is in place. If there are deviations, then you take corrective actions, and all of that is done with the motive of achieving the objectives of the organization. Okay, so controlling is about measuring and correcting subordinates' performance of activities. Then we also have a concept known as control system. So in the course of trying to control, one of the mechanisms or the systems that you need in place is what is known as a control system. So a control system is a device or a set of devices used to manage, command, direct, or regulate the behavior of other devices or systems. Okay, so you need a control system that will try and bring together all the control systems or devices that you have within the organization in order to keep track of how the entire control activities are being done in the particular organization. All right, so you need a control system in place in order to monitor other devices or the other control systems that you have within the organization. And in doing so, management will need what is known as a management control systems. Okay, and management control systems gather and use information to evaluate the performance of organizational resources, including human, fiscal, and financial. So to be able to control, we said you need to measure. Okay, compare the measurement with the standards that you have in place. That will help you to know whether there are deviations and what else should be done about that deviation or those deviations that you have identified. All right, what it means is that you need information gathering in order to be able to tell what has actually been done. Okay, and that the system that management must rely on in order to gather and evaluate information is what is known as management control systems. All right, so you need to have a control system in place to gather and monitor whatever is happening with all the control systems or devices that you have in the organization. Then you also need what is known as the management control system that will help you to gather and use information to evaluate how the performance of the organization is going as far as your management style or your management activities are undertaking in the organization. So the control systems basically focuses on information, because control is all about gathering information about the actual performance of your employees or subordinates so that you can measure or compare that with the standards that you have put in place in order to determine whether things are going according to the plans that you have in place. Okay, so these are the concepts. We've seen at the definition of control. We've looked at a control system, what it is. Then we've just looked at the concept of management control systems, which borders on the gathering of information in order to ease the control process. We move to the characteristics of control. Okay, the first one we want to look at is that control and planning are closely related. So from our definition, we said the main purpose of control is to achieve organizational objectives. And these objectives, as I indicated earlier, will normally be contained in your plans or during the planning stage. That is when you set the objectives, all right? And the objectives also become the standards. And much earlier, I said in the planning stage, you also determine the strategies and the tactics that you'll be using. So you've indicated what the strategies and the tactics, you've set your objectives. You now want to compare in reality whether the strategies that you said you'll be using are actually working or not. Okay. And how to do that is to look at what is actually being done against what you said you wanted to do. What you said you wanted to do will normally be contained in your planning in terms of the objectives that you said you want to achieve, in terms of the tactics and strategies that you said you wanted to use. But the control is in reality what has been done. So there is close relationship. Planning will establish or set the standard. Controlling will measure the actual performance and compare the actual performance with the standards that have been set during the planning stage. So the standards are basically the objectives that you said you wanted to achieve, the tactics that you said you wanted to achieve, the resources you said you wanted to achieve. All the things that you will have indicated in your plans are the standards, and controlling will measure the actuals and compare that with the standards that you set in your planning. So there is a close relationship. Without plans being put in place, it will be very, very difficult to control, okay, because controlling relies on plans or the standards in planning, set in planning, in order to be effective. Okay, point 2, control is both an executive process and a system of an organization. So we know that control is one of the core functions of management or executives of an organization. So we said they include planning, organizing, leading, and also controlling. So as a manager, one of your main functions is to control the activities of your organization to avoid wastage in order to be able to achieve the objectives of the organization. So it's part of the executive process or management process and a function that every manager must perform. But at the same time, controls are systems that are integral to every organization. So much earlier, we spoke about having a control system, and we also spoke about having management control systems. So these are really systems that are parts of the architecture or the structure of a particular organization. So the control first is a function, and also it is part of the systems that the organization must have. All right. So management, when they try to ensure that things are done the right way based on the plans that they have in place, that is the aspect of controlling, which is the executive process or function. But for example, in most organizations these days, they have CCTV cameras to monitor how things are being done within the organization. That is really an architecture or part of the system of the organization. So it's part of controlling, okay, but it is not so much the function of management, but it is an aspect of the entire organization. It is incorporated in the organization to ensure there is minimum theft cases, to ensure that people won't just come to work and be idling about and so on and so forth. Okay, so control is both the function that management must perform, and it's also a system of an organization. It is part of the system of every organization, provided they are serious about ensuring that things are done the proper way. Okay. Point 3 says control is a continuous process. All right. So as I indicated, even at the planning stage, you want to ensure that your plans are right. And that is control, part of control. You don't just set objectives out of the blue. You should have been conversant about your strengths and weaknesses. You should have known about your opportunities and threats, and that will help you to be able to set the right type of objectives. So control will ensure that even in setting the standards, the right standards are done. Okay, control will ensure that in organizing, you get the right type of, you gather the right type of resources and also put in place the right structures and systems that are relevant for the type of organization that you are currently managing. All right. So control is needed there as well. When it comes to leading, control, we want to find out whether you're leading the organization in the right way. All right. Then it is back again when you start with your planning of everything, as I indicated, involves control. So it is a continuous process. At each stage of the core functions of a manager, there will always be some element of control that is involved. It's not something that you do and go and sleep. At any point in time, you have to keep monitoring the activities from all of the functions, core functions of management, right from the planning to the leading or the control stage itself. Okay. Control is a coordinated, integrated system. So it is very, very important that you have an integrated system, because if you just limit control activities to one aspect or department of your organization, it will not work. It will not be efficient. Okay. So you might be more interested in, say, the input stage, the supply chain stage, where you buy the raw materials for your organization, for example, and you have systems in place to make sure that they are bought, they buy, supply chain managers or people, they buy the right type of input in terms of quality, in terms of price, and so on and so forth. Okay, if you have control systems in those places, but when it gets to transformational stage of these raw materials or input to finished products, there are no control systems. It is possible the inputting or the input stage, which is the acquisition of raw materials and so on and so forth, will have been done perfectly. But because there were no controls during the transformation stage, there could still be a lot of wastage in the organization. So it is important that it cuts across all the stages of production in a particular organization. And beyond the stages of production, you need controls everywhere. I just spoke about CCTV camera. Sometimes it's not just about productivity. It could be issues of theft cases happening within the organization. All right. So it's all embracing, it's integrated in all of the systems and the activities of a particular organization. So don't limit controls to just one place. It must be an coordinated, integrated, and the overall architecture of your organization. Okay. Point 5, control is neither the beginning of management process, nor is it the end function. I think I've explained this much earlier. All right. So you need control for all of the processes, all of the functions of management. I said, even when you are planning, controlling is important. If you don't have the consciousness to involve controlling, you are likely to set unrealistic goals and objectives. You are likely to pick tactics and strategies that will not work. So even at the planning stage, you want to check the plans that you want to put in place against what the reality is as far as the environment of the business is concerned. If you move to the other functions, control is always important. So we cannot place control to either at the beginning or at the end of the functions of management, because at every stage, in fact, you still have to even check your own controlling systems that you have in place to find out whether they are in tune with whatever is happening in your environment. So controlling is required at all the 4 functions, core functions of management. Okay, so it's neither the beginning function nor the end function of management. At every stage, we will need control. Point 6, control is a dynamic process. All right, so I just hinted on that. So sometimes you might have 9 systems in place, but with time, they may not really be effective anymore. It's just like how the police service or the security service deal with criminals. Okay. These criminals with time gets to know the strategies and the tactics that are employed by security personnel. and then we'll find a way to outweigh them. So the same thing, the environment change, a lot of things change, and it is important that your control systems are updated to cater for the changes that might be happening in the external environment. Otherwise, one day you realize that you didn't have any control systems in place at all. So control is dynamic. You don't just put in place one thing and expect that it will work at all times. It is possible, it may be possible that there will be the need to change how things are done. So control is a dynamic process. 7 says control is exercised at all levels of management. So it's similar to the integrated explanation. It should be coordinated and integrated at all levels. If you pay attention to one level and you don't pay attention to the other level, you might be wasting your time. So at the operational level, tactical level, corporate level, it is important that we put in place the right type of controls. Okay. Control is identified with individuals. What this point is trying to indicate is that you need to be able to hold people accountable in order to ensure that controls are effective. So you first and foremost, controls are based on the structure, a very good organizational structure, where you have people responsible for certain activities. And within the context of the responsibility and accountability of the employees or the staff that have been assigned to these things, that is where you also have to incorporate the element of control. Okay, such that when something goes wrong, it should be possible for us to identify the individual or the individuals that made that mishap or misfortune to happen. So control aren't just systems that you put in place without anybody being in charge of ensuring that they are working effectively. Controls are actually based on individuals. They rely or depend on individuals for them to be effective. Okay, so that is the idea of control is identified with individuals. We should be able to say that you were responsible, a particular named employee was responsible for a particular activity, and he or she failed in that particular activity, and not just a control that exists on its own, independent of anybody being held accountable for how effectively or otherwise it works. Okay. Point 9 says control does not necessarily mean curtailment of the rights of subordinates, managers, and individuals. So it is also very, very important as a manager to note that if you're bringing in place control systems, you still have to pay attention to the rights of subordinates, managers, and individuals. For example, you may have a CCTV camera at the shop floor of your organization or company, or at places that no privacy or other issues may be breached of an employee. But you cannot have it in places where the privacy of employees will be breached just because you want to control the activities within your organization. No, that is not it. You still have to respect the privacy of individuals in your bid to control the activities in the organization. So it is important to know where and at where you can have these control systems in order not to invade upon the privacy of your employees. So control does not necessarily mean the curtailment of the rights of your subordinate. They still have their rights. Managers still have their rights. Individuals have their rights. Okay, so it's important that we don't breach any law in our bid to ensure that things are being done right in our organizations. 10 says control is not like interference. Okay, so very similar to point 9. Control is basically to monitor, and most of the time the monitoring is done based on the activity that is actually done. There is not so much of trying to interfere with whatever an employee is doing. Interference, that is not control, all right? Control is you've been given directives as to what to do. You have the freedom to do what you've been asked to do. But in the course of doing that, you want to find out whether you've met the standards that we set in place. Okay, so you have the freedom to do it anyway. But at the end of the day, we'll be checking to find out whether what you did is in accordance with the standards that we've put in place. So control is not about interfering with the work of subordinates. So supervisors and managers must be mindful of that as well, instead of continually just seeking to direct and somehow manipulate with the workforce. Control is not about interference at all. Prerequisites of good control systems. I think we've hinted on this. That point one, control requires planning. A control technique must be based upon clear and integrated plans. In a way, control is the reverse side of planning. The plans formulated by management become the standards by which desired actions are measured. So I think we've explained this much earlier. So in the planning, that is where you set the standards. So the objectives that you put in place are standards. The strategies that you said you'll be using are standards. The tactics that you said you'll be using are standards. The resources that you said you'll be using are standards. And now we come to the reality to see what has actually been done, and then compare that with the standards that we put in place during the planning stage. Okay, so it is obvious that without planning, control almost becomes unnecessary, because control must rely on the plans that has been put in place to determine whether these plans or these objectives and targets have been achieved or not. Okay. Point two says control requires organizational structure. So the goals, objectives, and strategies of an organization require every person to contribute to their accomplishment and to share responsibilities. So I've explained this also. The organizational structure is about indicating who is responsible for what in terms of accomplishing some tasks or achieving some targets. And as we indicated, it is in the course of knowing who is responsible for what that we also include the control element. All right. The point that we said control is about individuals, or individuals is related to individuals. So we need to know who was responsible for what activity. And this can only be known within the context of a well-established organizational structure. All right. The structure will have indicated who is responsible for what. And in the course of establishing their responsibility, we can also then hold people accountable when they fail to do that which is required of them. So control requires a good organizational structure for it to be effective. It relies on good organizational structure, just as it does with planning. Okay. Essential features of a good control system. So for a control system to be good, it must have the following characteristics. Point one, the control must reflect the nature and needs of the activity. So whatever control system that you put in place, it must be connected to the activity of the employee or the subordinate. Okay. So it might be CCTV, but is it necessary at that particular point in time? Is it in all cases that you will need that? It may be a particular budget that you have set in place. Is budgeting required as a control tool for that particular activity? It may be some policies or guidelines. Is that what is required at that point in time? Whatever it is, one of the features of a good control system is that it must reflect the nature and the needs of the activity of the subordinate at that particular point in time. Otherwise, it might be a control system, but really, it is not too important or critical at that point in time. Okay, so the control system might be there, but because it is not related to the activity, things can actually go bad, and you will not be able to detect that because you use the wrong control system for that particular activity. Okay, point two, control should be so designed that its activity, its implementation procedures, and its very purpose become apparent. So controls, you need people to work with the control systems, and there shouldn't be any ambiguity as to the type of activity to which that control system is applicable, its implementation procedures, and the very purpose of that particular control system. Okay, so people must know, why do we have CCTV camera at this point in time? What is the organization seeking to achieve with that? People must know, why do we have a budget for this particular activity? What is the essence of the budget? Is it actually related to the type of activity that we're going to do? Okay, so the implementation procedures, the activity, and its very purpose should not be in doubt. We must know the details of the control system, all right? And that will help all employees to cooperate and make sure that the control system works effectively. So there should be clarity, and it is one of the features of a good control system. Point 3 says control should report deviations promptly. That is also very, very critical. So what is the point in getting to know that things were going wrong, but at the time that you got the feedback, you couldn't have done anything again because the feedback came very late? Okay, so the control system, a good control system, should be able to provide the manager with prompt deviations within reasonable time, so that you can actually correct the deviations before they turn into something bigger or a bigger problem altogether. All right, so control system should report deviations promptly. If it delays, as I indicated, it might as well have been good not to have it in place in the first place. All right, but if it provides deviations on time, it provides the manager with the opportunity to be able to correct the deviations before things get bad. We have point 4, effective control systems detect deviations before they occur. Right, so the third one is about reporting promptly. The fourth one is that for it to be far even better, a control system should detect deviations before they occur. All right, so you don't wait for the deviations to occur before you even report. Okay, so in practice, most of the time, as I indicated, you don't start your control system, say, at the production stage. If you start having control systems at the production stage, you will have missed the first step. All right, because at the production stage, the wrong type of raw materials will have been used. If it's in connection with employees, the wrong, unqualified, unskilled employees will have already been employed. And so the control systems at the production stage will not be too useful because you did not cater for the entry stage. All right, so you should have in place control systems that will avoid, first and foremost, the acquisition of poor quality inputs or raw materials, the recruitment and the selection of poorly qualified employees in that particular organization, in which case you're actually trying to detect deviations, to detect problems before they become actual problems. So good or effective control systems detect deviations before they occur. All right, before we wait for production levels to fall, we should, at the recruitment stage, make sure that we are employing competent people. Before, yes, the same production, we should, at the purchasing and supply chain stage, make sure that we're buying quality inputs. Before there is low productivity, we should have been careful that we bought the right type of equipment and technology in order to avoid that from happening. Okay. Point 5 says control should be objective. Very, very important. And remember that it is in connection with individuals. So whatever is applicable to person A should be the same as person B. If there are deviations in terms of the control mechanisms with somebody, if something happens, then it's an issue. But with another person, the same thing happens and no action is taken, or it's as if no deviation has occurred, then it creates a problem. Control system should avoid subjectivity as much as possible. It's the standard that we've kept in place, that if you want to do a particular activity, these are the things that you need to follow. If that is the case, that should be applicable to everybody within the organization. It should not vary from person A to person B. Okay, so that is the idea of the fact that control should be objective. It should be the same for everybody within the organization. Point 6, ideal control is instantaneous, self-correcting, and forward-looking. So for an ideal control, as we indicated, it should be able to detect these errors very fast. By itself, it should be able to self-correct itself. All right. So it should be able to find a way to correct these deviations and should be able to send signals. Correcting may not be the machine or the system correcting, but it should be able to send early signals for these corrections to be made before we proceed with any production activity or service that we are rendering to our clients and so on and so forth. Then it should be forward-looking. I think we've explained this much earlier. Control systems, the best and ideal ones, don't wait for the deviations to occur before we start working on them. All right. Good control systems actually help us to detect the problems before they occur. So it should be forward-looking. In our example of recruitment and selection, we should be able to project that based on the quality or the qualification of the people that we are employing. There is the likelihood that they will not be able to do the activity for which they are employed. That is forward thinking, so that we can drop people that are least qualified or not qualified and pick competent people into our organization. All right. So yes, so the procedures, the interviews, the various tests that all of these applicants will normally undergo is part of control systems to make sure that the most qualified or competent people finally gets the opportunity to work with the organization. Why? Because we are forward-looking. All right. We want to look at the abilities, the competencies of whoever we are employing against the future performance, the anticipated performance of such an individual. So it is very, very important that you don't actually wait for deviations or the problems before you kick in the control process. For an ideal control system, it should be instantaneous, it should be self-correcting, and better still, it should be forward-looking. You should be able to project into the future and say that if we don't do this today, we are likely to face certain challenges or problems tomorrow. Okay. Point 7, the control system must have the scope to adapt itself to new development. That is also very, very important. When we're talking about the fact that control systems are dynamic, I hinted on this. Okay, so there are several changes happening both in the internal and external environment. And if the control system is not capable of being adapted or adjusted to suit this new development, with time, they become very, very irrelevant because the environment and the situation will have changed. So it is very, very important that the control systems that we have in place can adapt itself to new development and changes happening in the external environment. Point 8 says it should reflect the organization pattern. So the control system, we said it has a relationship with the organizational structure. Okay, so that is the idea. It must reflect the structures and systems within the organization so that almost every aspect or dimension of the organization is well addressed and catered for. Okay, so it should reflect the organizational pattern. 9 says a control system should be economical in the sense that the cost of its installation and maintenance is justified by its benefits. So as much as you want to ensure that things are done properly, that must be done economically. All right. There is no point spending money such that the cost of the control system itself outweighs any benefits that will come from the control system. Okay, in which case really we have a net loss instead of a net gain. So in our bid to ensure that we have control systems in place, we also have to pay attention to the economics so that we don't spend unreasonably on control systems. Point 10 says strategic point control points out exceptions at critical points. So the other thing is that a manager shouldn't just be concerned with any little deviations that may be occurring within an organization. If you do that, you will not have time to think strategically as to the future directions, because you always be worried about operational issues and so on and so forth. So strategic point controls are meant to highlight significant deviations. Okay, if it's a deviation that has the tendency of causing a mess, a major problem of the organization, then it brings that to the attention of management. So a good control system must also have what is known as the strategic point control, where you've made allowance for some tolerable level of deviations, but once the mishap or the deviation exceeds that level, there should be a signal for management to know that something significant has gone wrong. All right. So it shouldn't be that any minor deviations, then an alert is given and so on and so forth. As I indicated much earlier, that actually becomes a distraction, because sometimes the deviations are things that are very minor that can be corrected by the employee, and then the process will continue. So you need in place what is known as strategic point control, where only critical issues or major deviations are brought to the attention of management. Okay. 11 says the modern control system is worker focused rather than work or job oriented. All right. So the job or work oriented is where the control is basically about productivity, how to enhance productivity. But as we indicated much earlier, in the modern control systems, it's actually about the individuals that are in the place in particular positions of authority and responsibility. At the end of the day, if they do that which is expected, then the byproduct will be increased in productivity. So it's not so much about the productivity or output. It's so much about who is supposed to be doing what and making sure that the right things are done. Once we get people doing, or individuals doing, that which is expected of them, we can sleep with the hope that productivity or the jobs that they are supposed to be doing will be done perfectly. Okay, so it's not so much about productivity, but it's about worker focus, making sure that workers go alongside the boundaries that have been set for them, alongside the descriptions that they are supposed to follow in doing their jobs, and so on and so forth. Okay, point 12. Control should be motivating. It should not be coercive. So that is similar to the idea that control is not about interference, all right? And control is not about evasion of privacy. It should be motivating. It should be challenging, and employees should be excited trying to meet these control standards that have been put in place. Once it becomes coercive, it is likely to be counterproductive. If it becomes coercive, what happens is that employees will be negatively motivated to find a way to rather beat these control systems within the organization. So we should avoid having control systems in place in order to coerce employees. So types of controls, these types are based on stages of production. So it will be more relevant in the context of manufacturing industries, all right? Based on production or stages of production, we have 3 types of controls. We have the preliminary control. Preliminary control or feed-forward control is exercised during the planning and the assignment of resources. So I think I spoke about it when I kept talking about input. Okay, so before you even get into manufacturing, you want to plan and make sure that the right type of resources are acquired. All right. So during the plan and the assignment of resources, you want to get the right quantity of resources. You want to get the right quality of resources. You want to assign these resources to the most qualified person in order to ensure that the right things are done. All right. So this occurs before the actual operation takes place. All right. Then we move to the second type, which is monitoring. So monitoring is also known as concurrent control. So examines actual ongoing operations to ensure that objectives are being met. So the first one is during the input stage, you get the right type of resources in terms of quantity, quality. You get the right qualified employees to work on them. Then whilst the operation is ongoing, there must also be control systems to make sure that the objectives at that stage or set for those stages are also being met. Okay. So the fact that you've met the preliminary control requirement doesn't mean that you should leave everything just like that. You need control systems also to monitor the actual operation or production process. And that is what is known as the concurrent control. Whilst production is ongoing or operations is ongoing, are they being done in such a way that the standards that have been set as far as the operations are concerned are being met? Okay, then we move to the last one, evaluation or feedback control. So this one focuses on results. All right. So the operations or the monitoring is when things are still in the production stage. When you finally get the results out, we want to compare that with what we said we wanted to achieve. So that's the evaluation or feedback control. Okay. So see the names. The first one is feed forward. Before you even start with everything, there must be controls in place. And after you are done, feedback. You want to compare what you've done against the results or the standard that you said you wanted to achieve. So within the context of production, we have these three types of controls. Feed forward control, laying a lot of emphasis on getting the right type of input or raw materials. Concurrent control, making sure that the operations or production is going as planned. Then feedback control, want to compare the finished products with the specifications that we had in mind, whether we were able to achieve those specifications. Okay. Then we have some other classifications of types of control, right? So this, if you want, general types of controls that you normally have in an organization. The earlier three we said were types of control that focus on the stages of production. And I said they will be more useful in manufacturing organizations, but as well in services. So if it is a service, the preliminary would be things that I've said much earlier. Maybe the type of people that you employ. You employ the right type of people. During the monitoring stage, you want to find out whether they are really rendering the service for which they were employed. All right. Then finally, you want to see the results. It could be in terms of customer satisfaction. It could be in terms of sales or profitability, in order to determine whether you employ the right type of people. All right. But we have these other classifications too. So the first one is what is known as strategic control. Okay, so since strategies are forward-looking and designed to accomplish the objectives in the future, it is necessary to enforce control. So first and foremost, strategies are forward-looking. They are meant to be achieved in the future, all right? But because they are futuristic, we need to have some control systems in place right now. Otherwise, if you want to wait for the 5-year time or 10-year time, it will be too late to determine whether you'll be able to achieve that target or not. All right. So strategic controls are meant to achieve the long-term objectives that you've set in place for yourself. And therefore, they rely on, so organizations enforce strategic control through what is known as premise control, implementation control, strategic surveillance control, and special alert controls. All right. So strategic controls, we said, they are controls that we put in place in order to achieve the long-term vision or objectives of the organization. And in our bid to achieve these long-term objectives, we have to ensure that we have these other types of controls. So we have the premise control, the implementation control, strategic surveillance control, and special alert control. So what is premise control? So that is the second type of control out of the strategic control. It is about systematically and continuous checks whether the premises set during the planning and implementation process are still valid. So the premises are basically assumptions. And these assumptions, as I kept explaining, are based on your internal and your external environment. Okay, so the assumptions normally based on what you consider to be your strengths and weaknesses, or what you consider to be your opportunities and threats. With time, these assumptions based on which you projected that you wanted to increase your profit margin by 30% or 25% are likely to change. Okay, something you consider to be a strength may no longer be a strength, or something you consider to be a weakness at the time of setting your strategic objectives may no longer be a weakness. Some opportunities may no longer be opportunities, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very important at any point in time in your bid to achieve your long-term objectives, not to lose sight of the assumptions that were used as a basis of setting those objectives. Okay. If the assumptions have changed, and your strategies were built on those assumptions, what it means is that there is a higher likelihood that you'll not be able to achieve your long-term objectives. All right. But if you were based on premise control, if you were to readjust your strategies and tactics to take into cognizance of the new changes in the premises or the assumptions, what it means is that you are better able and better positioned to be able to achieve your strategic objectives. So premise control, the first kind of control that is needed in strategic control, is what is known as the premise control. And it's very, very critical. If you operate based on wrong assumptions, it is highly possible that you will not be able to meet your strategic objectives. The second, under the strategic control, or in order to achieve your strategic control, is the implementation control. It assesses whether the overall strategy results relates to the incremental steps and actions. All right. So whatever results you've achieved at any point in time, you want to find out whether the results can be attributed to the incremental steps and actions that you took based on the strategies or the tactics that you had in place. It is very, very important because you may be achieving certain results, and the results may not be as a result of the strategies or tactics that you put in place. It may be just some coincidence or some chance, some luck, in which case you might not be able to attribute the credit to a good strategy. This is important because some of these windfalls don't happen all the time. And so if it is not based on strategy and it's just based on sheer luck, what it means is that going forward, you might not be able to achieve that kind of resource anymore. But if you can be certain that the outcomes or the results that you're achieving can be attributed to the incremental steps and actions based on your tactics and strategy, then that is a good feedback for you to continue with those tactics and those strategies. Then we have 4, strategic surveillance. It monitors a broad range of internal and external events that are likely to threaten the course of the company's strategy. So very similar to point 2, which is the premise. All right. So you have to keep monitoring your environment, the things that are happening in your internal and external environment, because they have the potential of threatening your company strategy. Okay. One thing, once the environment change, what it means is that the current strategy may no longer be suitable, and probably something must be done about that. The only way to get to know whether your internal environment is changing or external environment is changing is to have a control system in place known as strategic surveillance. Okay, surveillance is monitoring so that you keep surveying both your internal and external environment. All right, we have what is known as special alert control. It is enforced to rapidly reconsider the basic strategy based on sudden changes. So it flows from surveillance. Once we realize that some drastic change has happened in the external or in the internal environment, it calls for some sudden changes, some changes in the strategy or the tactics or the activities that we're currently undertaking in a particular organization. So you need that. So you don't wait until the strategy is 5-year plan. So if there are even sudden changes, you want to stick with your plans, you want to stick with your tactics, you want to stick with your activities as they are now, course of actions as they are now, it is very, very likely you will fail at the end of the day. So you need special alert controls. And as I said, it will be born out of your surveillance through the checks. Once you realize there is some sudden change either in the internal or external environment, it might be time to also bring about some changes in the type of strategy or course of actions that you are pursuing as a manager. Okay, C type of control is known as tactical control. So tactical control focuses on assessing the implementation of tactical plans at departmental levels, monitoring results, and taking corrective action if necessary. All right. So from the name, tactical control, they focus on controls focus on the departmental levels of the organization. All right. What is really happening at the departmental level, not the corporate level, not the shop floor or operational level, but at the departmental level. That is the interest of tactical control. Okay, then we move to the operational control. Operations managers also need control methods appropriate to their level of strategy implementation. Their primary concern is the allocation and use of company resources. Okay, so operational controls are also very important at the operational level. All right. So together, these control systems can help an organization to be able to achieve the objectives that is put in place in their strategy plans. All right. So you need operational control systems, you need tactical control systems, you need special alert control systems. You need strategic surveillance, you need implementation control systems, you need premise control systems, and all of this will help in ensuring that you have what is known as strategic control system in place in order to be able to achieve the long-term objectives or targets of the organization. Okay. I hope this is clear. Let's move to other categorization, but this time around is by Simon's levers. It's known as the Simon's levers of control. So it's coming from the scholar that proposed these types of control. Okay, so Simon's levers of control. One can understand the process of enforcing control by understanding this framework. So it's a framework that seeks to explain how to ensure that control is effectively done in an organization. All right. What should a manager concentrate on in order to ensure that there is effective control or things are done effectively within an organization? So number one, there are 5. He spoke or he suggested what is known as internal controls. All right. And these are controls that are familiar to most of us, especially if you are into auditing and accounting. All right. So these are customary safeguards that a company establishes to protect company assets and ensure reliable record keeping. So we have internal controls that is there to ensure that company assets and property are properly protected, most of the time through reliable record keeping. So that is his first focus, that if you claim to be a manager that is in charge as far as control systems are concerned, one of the areas that you have to pay attention to is what is known as internal controls. There are proper records in order not to lead to the abuse and the wastage of the resources or assets of a particular company. So first and foremost, every management, according to the Simon's levers of control, must have internal controls in place. Okay. Point two, he believes that there is, apart from internal controls, you need to have what is known as belief systems. Okay, so belief systems relate to the fundamental values of an organization. So his argument is that if you build the right values as an organization, in terms of having the right type of vision, having the right type of mission, having the right type of organizational culture, those invisible or intangible things has a way of controlling employees' behavior. Okay, so if you build in them values of integrity, values of honesty, hard work, and so on and so forth, probably you won't have to buy CCTV to monitor how they work and how they operate. So building the right type of values, organizational culture, Simon's belief is another important way to control activities in the organization. So it's not just about internal controls, having good internal audits, having qualified accountants and so on and so forth to keep records. But the other way to control employees and members of your organization is by paying attention to the belief systems of the organization. Build right values, develop the right organizational culture. And once you have the right organizational culture, there is the higher tendency that people will work and behave in a way that is expected of them. All right. So one way to control is actually to look at the belief systems and develop the right ones as a manager. Right. Beyond the belief systems, he believes the third one, you need to have what is known as boundary systems. Boundary systems. These are what an organization must have so that it can stake out the territory for each participant. So every organization, if you're a good manager, one of the other ways that you can control the behavior within that organization is to create boundaries. People must know their limits, what they can do and what they cannot do. So to Simon, one of the ways by which we can also control people or activities within an organization is to create boundaries for each participant within the organization. So example is code of conduct. So people know the type of behavior that is acceptable and that which is not acceptable within the organization. You can have policies that clearly state what can be done and what cannot be done. The same applies to rules and regulations. So these are all boundary systems that can be put in place to clarify to everybody what is expected of them as far as the organization is concerned. Okay, so you can have boundary systems in place as a form of control mechanisms. And I think we are used to that. Okay, almost all of us, we're working in an organization where there's likely to be code of conduct or code of ethics, and there are likely to be policies, rules, and regulations that communicate to us what we can do and what we cannot do. All right, so it's another important mechanism of controlling people in an organization. Have boundary systems. The fourth one, he says, have what is known as diagnostic control system. Diagnostic control systems. Okay, this must be put in place by a company so that they can optimize outcomes and get work done in order to achieve organizational objectives. All right, so to diagnose really is to find out whether things are going as expected. All right, and if they are not going well, what should be done about that? So the next one is to find ways by which you can find out whether things are working right or not. Okay, so you want to find out. You can do that through, for example, output measurements. Okay, you have boundaries in place, you have belief systems in place, you have internal controls in place. How do you even get to know whether these control systems are working as expected of them? You need to have output measurement to find out whether people are doing that which is expected of them. Okay, one way to also do that is to check. For example, if productivity is low, you want to pay attention to the incentive systems in your organization, whether they are right or wrong. All right, so you can look at the incentive systems, and the incentive system can give a clue. Sorry, there was a little mishap here. So the diagnostic control system, as I was saying, is basically to find out the real stuff that are actually happening. You have to diagnose and find out whether things are happening as expected. So you have to have such control systems in place as well. Okay, and I said you need the output measurement to measure in real terms whether people are doing what is expected of them. One other way to do diagnosis is to find out whether the incentive systems are working the way they are. Probably productivity is low and output is low because you're using the wrong type of incentive systems, or it is not really motivating enough. Okay, so you need a set of control systems that will be interested in diagnosing how things are actually being done within the organization. Okay, then the last set of control systems that he says every manager must have is known as the interactive control systems. So smart organizations use this for tracking new ideas, for triggering new learning, and incorporating process data into management interaction and face-to-face meeting with employees. So you need to also have control systems that will actually allow for the generation of new ideas, and also not just new ideas, allowing for challenging assumptions and making suggestions and constructive criticisms. You need to have control systems in place that will provide a platform and monitor such activities. All right. For example, we may have a system in place that permits the generation of new ideas and probably the implementation of this type of new ideas. But how well are these ideas helping the organization in terms of its growth and expansion and so on and so forth? So you need an environment or control systems that will ensure that these things help the organization rather than to cause the organization to deteriorate or fall behind because of using and implementing the wrong ideas. Okay. So that is that for the Simon's levers of control. So he's basically giving managers an idea of the type of or the areas that they should be focusing on in order to ensure that things are being done well within the organization. Okay, so there are some sets of controls that he calls internal controls, okay, to safeguard the assets or the properties of a company. There are some sets of controls that he calls the belief systems. Okay, and this time around, it's about using the values, the organizational culture, and norms to control how people behave within an organization. Then he has other sets of control that he recommends that managers should have that he calls the boundary systems. Okay, that will specify what people can do and what people cannot do, for example, through rules and regulations, through policies, and so on and so forth. Then he has other control systems that you call diagnostic control systems. And then these control systems should help managers to find out the reality on the ground. Okay, are people actually working? Are the incentive systems working? Are the compensation systems working? You need to have control systems that will check these things. And it says there must also be control systems that will look at how people are allowed to be able to make suggestions, to make input, and how management takes this input or data into consideration when formulating policies and formulating strategies for a particular organization. All right. So it provides a very important framework for control. So we move to the process of control. So it begins with the establishment of standards. And we said these standards normally will be found in our plans. So during the planning stage, we will set plans or standards. We set standards. So the first essential element of any control process is to know what will be the results. So we need to have standards in our plans, okay? Then point 2 is measurement of performance. Once we have the standards, we now have to measure actual performance. So this requires measuring the work in terms of control standards and communicating the appraisal to persons responsible for taking corrective actions. So we want to find out. We said we'll be doing A, B, C, D in our plans. We want to find out whether it's A, B, C, D that we are doing and not any other thing else. So we want to measure the actual performance. The next logical step is to compare the actual performance and the standards. Okay, so you compare actual and standard performance. Comparison of actual and standard performance involves 2 steps: finding out the extent of deviations and identifying the causes of such deviations. Okay, so we want to compare first and foremost to see whether there have been deviations. We want to compare in order to see the things that led to such deviations. Then that will help us with the last process of control, correction of deviations. It requires that actions be taken to maintain the desired degree of control in the system or operation. Okay, once we compare and we know that there are deviations and we find out what really went wrong, then the natural step is to take some corrective actions to deal with such deviations. Let's quickly look at some methods of control. So all this while we've been talking about control, what are the various methods of control? All right. So Simon's Lever Pro helps us with the framework, right? But they were not actually the methods of control. He simply gave a guide as to where managers should be looking at in order to control effectively. Okay, so some of this will actually go to deal with the 5 dimensions of framework, the areas that he said as a good manager you need to be looking at whenever you want to exercise control over the activities of your organization. So point 1, or first method, policies. Policies are important means for implementing preliminary control, since these are guidelines for future actions. All right, so you establish policies and everybody must know these policies. They are meant to prevent them in the first place from doing the wrong things. So they are preliminary, okay? They are not meant to be obeyed after the activity have started. No, you need to know the policy of a particular activity from the onset to be able to tell your boundary. Okay. Point 2, job descriptions. Job descriptions are a part of control function since they predetermine the activities, responsibilities, and authority of the job holder. So once again, the boundary, what you can do and what you cannot do. Job description will tell you clearly what is expected of you, and it's a form of control system. Why? Because whenever we want to evaluate you, we have to do the evaluation, or your employer wants to evaluate you. The evaluation will be done alongside your job description. Okay. In your job description, we have the activities, the responsibilities that you were supposed, and the authority that you had as a job holder. So we now want to compare what is in your job description against what you actually did. So it's an important control mechanism. All right. So use performance appraisals to do that. Point 3, third method of control, we have quality control of materials. So the materials to be used in the production process must conform to quality standards. All right. So before we even start production, we want to find out whether we bought the right type of materials, and that is quality control of materials. We have budgets. The principal means of controlling the availability and interest cost of financial resources is budgeting. All right, so we want to provide some estimations of how much we can spend on a particular activity so that it serves as a guide. All right, if the deviation becomes wide, you need to provide explanation as to why you went beyond the budget. In some cases, you cannot just spend beyond that which you have budgeted for. Otherwise, you'll be committing some offense. Okay, so budgets are important methods of control. We have audits. Audits are principal source of information that enables a manager to evaluate a program. All right, so you can also conduct an audit, and it relies on most of the things that we've discussed much earlier, especially the budget, to find out whether you did things according to the plans that you set in place in your program. Okay, so you can audit the entire program to see whether things were done as specified within the program, and it's a method of control. We have standard cost analysis. Standard costs are predetermined costs as per the industry standard. So just like budgets, we have standard cost. If you want to produce this is how much it costs X. Okay, and that becomes a standard for employees or people that will be working to look at in their production. Okay, so if there is any variation, you need to provide explanation why you exceeded the standard cost in a particular industry. So it's an important method of control as well. Then we have employee performance evaluation. This is one of the most important and difficult feedback control techniques, right? Much earlier, we said your job description is important. So we now go and look at your performance and then compare with your job description. It is difficult because of the element of subjectivity that comes into place. Okay, so we basically want to rely on your supervisor or your immediate boss to be able to give an idea of your performance. Some jobs do not give room for objective criteria analysis, right? Unlike, say, molding of blocks or something that is physical, for us to be able to count and measure and compare with what you were supposed to do. Some of the things are qualitative, right? If you come to the service industry. So sometimes it's difficult to provide the accurate evaluation in performance evaluations. Then we have impact assessment. Many organizations, through analysis of their decisional impact, try to measure the implications of their plans and how far the planned objectives are met. So sometimes for some organizations, especially the NGOs, one of the ways to measure or control the activities is through impact assessment. You said this program will help this number of people to be able to get employment or to be able to do A, B, C, D. We have to go back and find out whether those planned objectives were met or not. Okay, so it's a control mechanism. If they were not met, why did that happen? And so on and so forth. Okay, then we have 9 graphic charts and diagrams. So organizational activities can be graphically displayed on chart graphs and network diagrams. Okay, for us to know. So it's a control mechanism. For example, Gantt charts for us to know whatever we're supposed to do at any point in time and whether actually we are doing that which we were required to do. All right, let's run through some usage of control. So control is used to standardize performance for increasing efficiency and reducing cost. Okay, so once we have controls in place, they standardize performance. You cannot really go beyond that. If you look at the issue of budget standard cost analysis, it's an example of that, so that we can bring about efficiency and reducing cost. Without control, people will have that freedom to spend as much as they want. But with control, there is some form of restriction as to how much you can spend and what you can do, and so on and so forth. Control is used to conserve company assets through the allocation of responsibilities, separation of operational, custodial, and accounting activities, and adoption of proper authorization and record keeping. All right. So all these activities are meant to ensure that company assets are kept. Okay. Otherwise, once people did not buy those assets out of their own sweat, there is the high possibility of theft cases happening or sheer abuse of this company assets. So controls will make sure that there is proper usage and conservation of company assets. 3, control is used to standardize quality through inspections, statistical quality control, and product specifications. Okay, so with controls, we don't get to do things as we want as employees, and this can lead to standardization of quality because there will be inspection and all that. Point 4, control is used for providing limits to delegated authority without further approval from the management at the top. Okay, so once we have control mechanisms in place, you don't always have to go back to the top management, right? For example, when it comes to, say, expenditure, there might be different amounts stated in terms of how much a departmental head can spend, how much a regional head can spend, and so on and so forth. And once the expenditure is within these limits, you don't necessarily have to call for approval from head office anymore. Okay, they are within your limits. And so you have the right to be able to spend such amount to undertake the activities of an organization. And this is important because it can most of the time be frustrating getting approvals from head office to get things done at the branch level or at the local level. Okay. 5, control is used to measure job performance through special reports, internal audits, budget, standard cost, and output per hour or employee. All right. So we can use control to measure performance. And that is also very, very important because we said the second process after we've set the standard is to measure the performance. Then we compare the performance with the standard. So control can be used to measure job performance. Control is used for planning future operations through sales and production forecast, budgets, cost standards, and other standards of measurement. All right. So they are all tools for control and that can help us in planning future operations. All right. So we don't just produce anything. We don't just any quantity and at any cost. No. Control will help us to make proper projections, even with regards to when we should go about production and so on and so forth. Control is used to help top management in keeping various plans and programs in balance through a master budget or policy manual. So if you have good control systems in place, we said it has to integrate all the various aspects of an organization. So master budget will deal with what marketing people are supposed to be doing, what production is supposed to be doing, what supply chain is supposed to be doing, and so on and so forth. So control will help top management to understand how all the departments and units within the organization are operating or are supposed to be operating. Okay. Point A says control motivates personnel through promotions, rewards for suggestions, profit sharing, and other methods of recognizing achievement. If you remember our explanation of diagnostic controls, okay, and Simon's levers of control, we said you need to find out what is really, really going on. And part of finding out that is through performance appraisals to really tell whether employees are working as expected or not. And once that is done, it leads to these things that we've spoken about. Okay. Assuming out of the performance appraisal, you find out that some employees are performing exceptionally well, then that will lead to promotions, that will lead to rewards, that will lead to profit sharing, and so on and so forth. The reverse is also true though. Okay. So if employees, based on one of the methods of control, performance evaluation, were to find out that some employees were not working well, then it can help in making decisions such as demotions, transfers, and probably firing the people out of the organization. All right. So that is that. The 9, control facilitates resource optimization. So you can't just be wasting the resources. It will provide a limit as to what you can spend and what you cannot spend, and so on and so forth. So that is the usage. And it is important for us to pay attention to these headlines because they are very, very related. Okay, so if you have usage of control, and we now coming to look at the importance of control. The usage is as it is. How do you use controls? And the importance are basically the benefits of controls. There could be confusion. Therefore, it is very, very important for us to take note of the differences. Okay, so the importance of control, point 1, the insurance value of control. So the risk of non-conformity of actual performance with intended goals is largely estimated by control. All right, so if you have a control systems in place, you can kind of minimize a form of insurance, the extent to which you are likely to deviate from your goals or the plans that you put in place, because it will help you to project things, to think about through things before you go into the actual execution of your plans. Okay, so it provides insurance value for an organization so that the risks of non-conformity will be minimized. Controls provide basis of future action. Evaluation of results makes available facts and information for future planning and organizing. So at the end of the day, if we're not able to meet our targets and we get to know the cause of that then helps us subsequently whenever we're setting our standards and or targets in our plans. Okay, so it will help us in a subsequent future during our planning stage to make sure that we set more realistic and more achievable goals, because we will have gone through the process and we have identified certain things that didn't go right, and so on and so forth. All right. Point 3 is very close. Controls provides indication of managerial weaknesses. Okay, so control helps to keep a check on other functions for ensuring successful management. It reveals where things went wrong, the weaknesses. We said when there are deviations, we look out for the deviations first to know the causes. Okay, we compare to know whether there are deviations and also to find out the causes. So it will reveal probably it was out of poor acquisition of inputs from our supply chain department. It could be as a result of production not doing what is expected. It could be coming from marketing, and so on and so forth. So it helps us to be able to know where things went wrong as far as the various functional areas of the business is concerned. Okay. Point 4, the facility of coordination. All right, or facilitation of coordination. Coordination is facilitated by the control function of management, right? So once we have the standards, we kind of work together, we pull together our knowledge and everything to make sure that we are able to meet this standard. So it leads to coordination. If we just pick just the objectives that the organization wants to achieve, it won't just take the effort of one department. All the other department and functional areas must be working together in order to be able to achieve the objectives that have been set in our plans. So it helps in coordination so that people don't work in their silos and individual groups. Then it leads to extension of decentralization. A consistent pattern of executive behavior and action can be maintained by controlling the use and application of standing plans throughout the organization. Okay, so if you have control systems in place, like policies, like rules and regulations, then it is possible to decentralize, all right, to allow lower level employees to make the decisions because you know you have the right control systems in place. All right, so you don't have to be afraid whether they would be doing the right things or behaving the right way or not. So controls actually leads to the extension of decentralization because the checks and balances will ensure that your the lower level managers and employees will be doing that which is expected of them. Okay. Shortcomings of control. So the shortcomings are actually from the process of control itself, right? So the first one is lack of satisfactory standards. There are many activities involving intangible performance for which no satisfactory standards can be established. During the process, we said the first one is establishment of standards, right? But whilst in cases of fiscal products or tangible activities, you can set standards. There are some cases I spoke about, service-oriented organizations, where it will be very, very difficult because some of the things are intangible. And that is one of the ways, difficulties of control. Okay. So they are intangible. And so it is very difficult to quantify and later compare the actual with that. And that is the problem. The inability or the lack of satisfactory standards in some cases is one of the shortcomings of control. Okay, and that then feeds into measurement as well. So second shortcoming of control is imperfections in measurement. So intangible performance creates difficulties in measuring results for evaluation. So the standards themselves are not tangible, so measurement becomes difficult. All right. Once again, service organization, it becomes difficult to measure. For this fiscal production, we can get to know who is lazying about and who is working hard. But in service, you need to be very creative to find a way to measure the employees of your employees. Okay, so intangible performance creates difficulties in measuring results for evaluation. Then limitation of corrective action. We said if there are deviations, take corrective actions, but there are limitations associated with the corrective actions themselves. So there are several limitations in taking corrective actions and avoiding mistakes. Okay, so the corrective action that you have to pick and choose in the first place, you are not even certain whether that particular action could lead to the results that is expected. Okay, and the last one is the human reactions to control. Control invites greater opposition from subordinates because it interferes with their actions and thinking. All right, so for most people, controlling is not a word that they want to hear because once you hear control, it's almost like your freedom is being taken away, or it's almost like you cannot reason for yourself. And as a result of all these feelings, control tends to face stiffer opposition. Okay, it deals with stiffer opposition when it comes to its enforcement or implementation at the workplace. All right. So let's run through. There are a couple of stuff that we have to do. Let's run through them quickly. We have various tools of control. And once again, pay attention. We'll discuss methods of control. They are not the same as the tools of control. So when you are studying control, it is important you pay attention to the subheadings. All right. So we've discussed methods of control. They are not the same as the tools of control. So various tools are used in organizations to enforce control. These include one, control limits. So control limits are standards. Standards are set in advance as a base for comparison with actual results to reveal any variation from the expected performance. So for every control, you have control limits. For example, budget will tell you how much you can spend, the maximum you can spend on a particular activity. Standard cost analysis will tell you the standard amount of money that you should spend on a particular activity, and so on and so forth. So it's a tool of control. Then we have control charts. They are used to present variance data over a period concerning the control limit sets. All right. So we have the charts that will indicate the extent to which we've varied from the limits that have been set, and so on and so forth. So you can also tell the extent to which we have been deviating and the extent to which we have been conforming to the control limits that have been set. Then we have Gantt charts. This technique graphically represents the progress of a project versus the time frame within which it must be completed. So Gantt charts will normally indicate the duration in terms of time when a particular project needs to be done. All right. So you want to look at where you've reached as far as the timing and the activity that should have been taking place in that project is concerned. All right. Then we have precedence diagrams. So precedence diagrams are designed to bridge the gap between manually operated planning systems like Gantt chart and systems that are designed for computers, such as the critical path method and program evaluation and review techniques. So it's basically a gap. So the Gantt chart, as we've seen, is manually done, and we have others that you normally use computer to do. But basically, it's the same idea where you want to find out when you should be doing what in terms of critical paths, which parts or which areas should you use in order to be able to achieve a particular resource very quickly. Okay. However, these diagrams are rarely used as control tools in modern organizations. So the precedence diagrams are not readily used in most organizations. Then we have PET, program evaluation and review technique. It's a network. Their network models are visual aids. Network models are visual aids that may be used to monitor and control activities. They are especially suited for disaster relief programs because no project is routine or repetitive, right? So they are meant for disaster cases where each program or each disaster could be unique in its own right. Then we have control ratios. The setting of standards and comparison of actual performance with standard or budgeted performance are an important part of the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. So you can use control ratio analysis also as a control tool. Okay, so most of the time you compute ratios in order to compare with previous years or to compare with industry standards as a way of control mechanism to see whether you are doing well or not. All right, so you can compare the previous year's net profit margin ratio or any type of ratio with the current year to find out whether you are doing well. Sometimes some industries have industry standards, so you compute your ratio and compare with that. So ratios are also tools of control. Okay, control techniques, and I think with the techniques we should be done. So pay attention to another heading. Okay, so if we looked at methods of control, we've looked at tools of control, and now we're coming to look at control techniques. So we have the first one, functional task analysis. This technique identifies and describes the functions or activities that must be performed to ensure that all operations are performed completely. Okay, so functional task analysis, as the name suggests, it pays attention to the functions or activities that must be performed and ensures that all the activities are performed completely. Okay, so no task or function is left unattended to or done halfway. All the functions and activities are supposed to be performed well, and the technique used is known as the functional task analysis. Then we have budgetary control. As budgets provide standards of performance, they usually become the base of control. So budgetary control is basically you want to compare what you've spent or your actual expenditure against your budget, all right? And the budgets themselves, as we've indicated much earlier, is they are used as control methods to ensure that we spend within our limits. After the expenditure, we need budgetary control to find out whether we did that which we were supposed to do in terms of the spending. Then we have the manufacturing control systems. The design of the control system in manufacturing directly relates to the mode of production and the organizational culture. Okay, so these are control systems that focuses on mode of production and the manufacturing setup and also the organizational culture. Okay, so on this note, we brought our lecture and discussions on control to an end. I hope this was helpful. So see you another time and all the best for the day.